Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia, guided by the United States Constitution, the history and values of the Union League of Philadelphia. The Legacy Foundation's mission is to create better informed, more engaged citizen leaders. We do this through a host of programs, including civics and constitutional educations for high school students, by providing scholarships to some of those citizen leaders, through historic preservation, and through programs like tonight's Library Hour. I'm pleased to report that last week we presented scholarships exceeding $300,000 to 13 Union League scholars, and we look forward to their success and sharing, hopefully in some small way, in that success. All of this is made possible through the generosity of League members and others who share and want to promote the values of the Union League of Philadelphia. And I thank them for their continued generosity, especially in these last few months. It's very heartening that we continue to see generosity coming from our membership in great numbers. And I thank them and others for their continued gifts. Tonight's program, we will have a Q&A function so you can ask questions, and our speaker will get to as many of those at the end of the program. And if you're watching on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is a partnership with ICAA, the Institute of Classical Art and Architecture. They're a great partner of ours for many, many years. And to introduce our speaker and our program tonight is the president of the Philadelphia chapter of ICAA, Mr. Steve Hendricks. Steve.
Yes, can you hear me? Good evening. Thank you to the Union League and the Legacy Foundation for generously collaborating with the Philadelphia Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. You are all such a wonderful audience, and I'm honored to help welcome you and thank you for attending. I'm particularly excited about this lecture because it addresses classicism as vernacular. We so often tend to regard classical architecture as pertaining only to the most formal and public buildings, and we easily overlook its presence in the aesthetics of everyday life, as the late Roger Scruton describes it. In its most generous and expansive applications, classical architecture imitates nature in providing spaces that respond to a human sense of beauty and proportion. It creates both indoor and outdoor environments that have us longing to be in them. We feel a special sense of being at home in these spaces because they find a place in our heart. Such are the humane goals of classicism in all its simplest and most developed forms. In thanking our sponsors, it should be noted that they are designers, curators, architects, and builders practicing these classic sensibilities in their work today. Our jewel sponsors are Capoletti Builders, North American Window and Door, Pine-Mar, Peter Zimmerman Architects, Tradewood Windows and Doors, Archer and Buchanan Architecture, Ernst Brothers Builders, Freeman's Auctioneers and Appraisers, John Milner Architects, LePage Millwork, Rittenhouse Builders, and Spire Builders. Tonight's speaker is Charles Duff. Charles is a planner, teacher, developer, and historian, and president of Jubilee Baltimore since 1987. He has led the revival of several dozen Baltimore neighborhoods and built or rebuilt more than 300 buildings. Known as an expert in historic architecture and urban history, he is also a pioneer in the development of residential and commercial buildings for artists and arts organizations. A graduate of Amherst College and Harvard University, he also studied at St. Andrews in Scotland and has walked every city and neighborhood to which he refers. He is past president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and has served on the boards of many community and professional organizations. He lectures widely and has taught at Johns Hopkins and Morgan State Universities. His recent book on which this talk is based is titled The North Atlantic Cities. Please join us in welcoming Charles Duff.
Good. Hi, I'm Charlie Duff, speaking to you in a virtual library hour from my actual library, which is in Baltimore. And I was hoping to be able to come up to Philadelphia and see you in person, but we'll just have to do the best we can. I want to thank my sponsors. It's wonderful. It's just wonderful to have organizations that do this. I'm delighted to be here. I'm proud to be here. I'm glad somebody cares about things that I care about. You always wonder, do people care about things that I care about? Boy, am I glad to find out that they do. And Philadelphia is not far from here. I love going to Philly. I've been going there all my life, and hope to keep doing it for a long time and hope to keep learning. You know, wonderful, wonderful place. But let's get to work. I hit share screen here. Is this what I do? Here we go. For a talk called The Row House's Classical Architecture. And if I had known that my sponsors were going to have such an elegant title slide, I wouldn't have made one myself, but I did the best I could. And now I've got to figure out how to move it. Okay. The story of the row house as classical architecture is one of many stories that I uncovered in 8 years of researching and writing a book called The North Atlantic Cities. I wrote this book for one purpose. My purpose is to introduce a new 4-word phrase into the English language. The 4-word phrase is the North Atlantic cities. What on earth do I mean by that? Well, let's find out. And let's find out about row houses as classical architecture. When I walk out of the front door of my house in Baltimore every morning, this is what I see. This is Landvale Street in a neighborhood called Bolton Hill, and this is where I live. Our cornices are big here in Baltimore. Jeff Cohen describes Baltimore as the land of mighty cornices. We're trying to figure out, Jeff and I, why this is so, but at any rate, we have them. And when I was growing up in Baltimore, I didn't travel much, but so I got used to the idea that a city is something that has lots of row houses. I didn't travel a lot, but I did travel some. I went to this city. This is Washington. This is Georgetown. I had a couple of aunts and uncles in Georgetown when I was growing up, went there a lot. Washington is very different from Baltimore, but in one respect, it's not. It has row houses like these. I went sometimes to this city. I probably don't need to tell you where this blurry image is. You can probably give me the exact address. You can tell me the year of its construction. I'm merely going to say that it's your city. And I started going to your city when I was young, and I've kept it up all my life and hope to keep it up. Your city is in many respects different from Washington and Baltimore, but in one respect, it's very similar. It has row houses, more row houses than any city in the United States, something you should be proud of, I think. When I was 20, through the miracle of a junior year abroad, I crossed the ocean and I found myself here. This is London. London, in some respects, is different from Philadelphia and Washington and Baltimore. That's particularly obvious when you try to cross a street in London. You'd better look the right way, or the wrong way, or the left way, or both ways, or God save you. But in one respect, London is a lot like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. London has row houses. And I wandered around London and other British cities for a year. And what did I think of the fact that they have row houses? Well, frankly, I didn't think much about it. I assumed that every city had row houses. That's what a city was. Then, in the summer I turned 21 with 2 of my old schoolmates. We got on a little packet in a little town on the coast of England, and 5 hours later, we were in Paris, where none of us had ever been. Paris is quite a place. I hope I don't need to tell you that. And it's hard to say something original about Paris, but I think I'm about to say something original about Paris. At least I'm about to say something that I've never heard anybody say about Paris. Paris does not have row houses. That's probably pretty obvious to anybody who knows Paris, but I didn't know Paris. It was a discovery. Paris has apartment houses. Paris is at 200 units to the acre, like Manhattan, but it doesn't have skyscrapers, so the apartments are very small behind those palatial facades. Most of them are cramped, most of them are dark, it's hard to entertain at home. So what do Parisians do if they have small, cramped apartments and the most beautiful streets in the world? I asked Mr. Google what they did. I Googled Paris street life, and this is what they do. And I wandered that summer around continental Europe, and I found that all the cities of continental Europe were, if you will, cities in the school of Paris. They were cities of apartment buildings. They had high densities and what I thought was quite brilliant street life. They did not have row houses. This was a second way of building cities. I didn't know there were two ways of building cities in the Western tradition, but all of a sudden there were. And I wondered why. I figured I can't be the first person on earth who ever noticed this. I'm just 21 years old. Somebody must have needed to get tenure. Somebody must have written a book or at least an article that would tell me why some cities have row houses and others don't. Still looking for that book. When I was 23, I went the other way. I visited a college friend on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains in what I would call continental North America. I wish that we were actually in the same room because I love to show this slide to a live audience and ask people, what city do you think this is? People give me answers that include just about every city in continental North America. People say that it's Indianapolis or Minneapolis or Dallas or Houston or St. Louis or Los Angeles. Some people even say Chicago. I look at it and I say, gee, where's that lake? So what's important? The city turns out to be Houston, but that's not important. What's important is that this is a typical city in continental North America. Ordinary people can look at this and they can say, well, it could be Houston, but it could be LA, it could be St. Louis. It's a typical city in continental North America. If you look at it, you'll see that there is a downtown of extreme density. But as soon as you leave the downtown, you get something that looks like Arlington National Cemetery. Very, very little density at all. Houston is built at about 5 units to the acre. Paris has 200 to the acre. Houston has 5 units to the acre. And I wonder if you have a house like a Houston house and it's big enough to entertain in and it's sunny, what kind of street life do you get? So I asked Mr. Google. I said, Google street, give me Houston street life. And this is the first picture that turned up. Very different from Paris, isn't it? So by the time I was 23 years old, I realized there weren't just 2 ways of building a city in the Western tradition. There were 3, and this doubled my conviction that somebody must have noticed and somebody must have written a book about it. And I thought, this is a book I want to read. When I came back to our row house world, I looked at it and I said, well, where are we? If you live in a row house, in a good row house neighborhood, your dwelling is large enough for you to feel at home and feel comfortable. It's not cramped, it's not dark, you can entertain at home. You're at about 20 units to the acre, sometimes 30, sometimes as high as 50. You don't have enough density to support restaurants and retail on every street like Paris, but you do have enough density to have a commercial street every 5 minutes or so. This is, we were looking at houses in Georgetown. Here's a commercial street in Georgetown, less than 5 minutes away. London's the same way, Amsterdam's the same way. A good row house city works like that. And if you're like me and you like it, you think, wow, we've got something good. We have the best of both worlds here. So I thought, since I've never read the book about why there are 3 kinds of cities, and particularly why there are row house cities, I'd better figure it out for myself. And I said, what should I call it? My first thought was to call it row house cities, but most people don't call them row houses. The British call them terraced houses. The Dutch, who invented them, just call them houses. New Yorkers call them brownstones, whether they're made of brownstone or not. So I looked for what they had in common, and what they had in common was their location on the 2 coasts of the North Atlantic Ocean. The row house region is a bicoastal international region of architecture and city building. It is the middle Atlantic states of the United States, going back as far west as Pittsburgh, with Richmond in the south, New York in the north, and outliers in Boston and Savannah. The European branch of the family includes the Netherlands, Belgium, the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, with a couple of outliers in coastal France that are very confusing. So I thought, what they have in common is this thing that appears to divide them. The North Atlantic Ocean, which for 400 years had the greatest trade routes and the greatest migration routes in human history, These cities need a name, and that name is going to be the North Atlantic cities. Wait, got to move this. Where'd that arrow go? Que voila, the North Atlantic cities. So that's why I bothered to write a book about this. And it turns out that the North Atlantic cities have 1 million stories buried in them. But this is a story about classical architecture. We all know what classical architecture is, at least I hope we do. It is the architecture of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Our ancestors also knew what classical architecture was, but they didn't know everything about it. They knew about temples because temples were big and tough, and some of them managed to survive. Here's the Maison Carrée in Nîmes in France. Thomas Jefferson copied it for the Virginia state capitol. And there is an awful lot of classical architecture in the Maison Carrée. Columns, architrave, pediment, all the toys of classical architecture. Well, not all of them, because domes are also a great toy of classical architecture. Here is the Pantheon in Rome, also built as a temple, big, tough, concrete, survived. And so when people began to revive classical architecture, which they began to do in the 1400s, they began to revive it by reviving the architecture of temples, because temples had survived. And the great imperial baths of Rome, they too had survived, though not as well. So in Washington, you get this fine example of Greek classicism. And in Philadelphia, you get this fine example also of Greek classicism with a Roman plan. This is classicism as most people think of it. When you think of classical architecture, you think of columns, pediments, sometimes domes. It's always big. But what about houses? Our ancestors in the Renaissance didn't know anything about the houses of the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans. We didn't know anything about the houses either until Pompeii was discovered and excavated, and Pompeii wasn't discovered until the 1760s. So it's no surprise that houses that were built in the classical tradition in the Renaissance and after tended to have the architecture of classical public buildings, and they tended to be pretty big houses. Here is Palladio's Villa Rotonda. It's about as small as it gets, outside Vicenza. Here is Monticello, designed by America's foremost follower of Palladio 200 years later. There is classical temple architecture with columns, architraves, pediments, a dome, all at a domestic scale. But it's a domestic scale in isolation. It's the domestic scale of a country house that is designed to sit at the top of a hill and dominate a landscape and be the only thing that you notice. The Renaissance tradition of houses, that is, the beginning of the idea that houses could have classical architecture, that beginning starts with this man, Leon Battista Alberti, who worked in Florence in the middle of the 1400s. To say that Alberti was an architect is like saying that Walt Disney was a cartoonist. Alberti did an enormous number of things and did them very brilliantly. But over there in my not quite virtual library is Alberti's big book on architecture, the 10 books on architecture. And it's obvious from Alberti's book that Alberti understood classical architecture as a system. He understood it as a language. It wasn't just a bunch of decorative details. It was a system of mathematical ratios and it with column modules and all of this stuff, all of the things that are basic to classical architecture as a language. Alberti understood that. He put it in writing and he built it. Here is Alberti's Church of San Andrea in Mantua, begun in 1472. This is modeled on the great imperial baths of Rome with the dome of the Pantheon lighting it. This is a dress rehearsal for St. Peter's in Rome, and it's amazingly early. It's 1472. So Alberti proves his classical chops. This guy knows what classical architecture is. And it is Alberti who designs the first city house embodying classical principles. Here it is, Palazzo Rucellai in Florence, 1452. If Alberti had been able to copy an actual house of the ancient Romans, I think he would have done it, or at any rate, he would have tried. But as it was, he had no idea what the actual houses of the ancient Romans were like. Pompeii wouldn't be discovered for more than 200 years. So he knew perfectly well what a modern Florentine house was like. He knew what modern Florentines in 1452 wanted their house to do. They wanted it to keep them warm in the winter. They wanted it to keep them dry in the rain. They wanted it to keep the sun off. It gets hot in Florence. They wanted it to store goods and people. They had figured out how their houses ought to be. Alberti taught them how their houses could look. And he was the first person who applied to the exterior of a house the orders of classical architecture and some of the details. Was he making it up? To some extent he was, but it's better to say that he was varying a theme. If you look at the top two stories, pilasters going up, architraves going across, the arches are filled in with windows, but try imagining that those arches are not filled in with windows. What do you get? Then look at the first floor. Look at all that masonry, nicely coursed. Look at those small square windows. You ever seen anything like that before? Well, Alberti had. Here's his model. It's nothing less than the Roman Colosseum. There you've got 3 stories of arches divided by pilasters and architraves. What Alberti put at the bottom on the first floor, the builders of the Colosseum put at the top, but it's the same idea. This is the first classical city house, 1452, Florence, Palazzo Rucellai, and it shows a pattern that we will see over and over again as architectural history rolls on, that somebody in one city after another will figure out how to meet the needs of modern clients with the proportional language and the decorative language of the ancient Romans of classical architecture. Over the next several hundred years, the Italians got better and better at this. Here is Palladio's Palazzo Chiericati in Vicenza. Palladio was not a copyist of the ancient Romans. Palladio was a great artist in the architectural equivalent of the Latin language. Palladio could think and could invent in the classical language of architecture. Are you looking at columns that are filled in, or are you looking at walls with porches? Hard to tell, but you are looking at a beautiful building. Is it just like the house of some ancient Roman? No, Palladio didn't know that. Nobody knew that. And Palladio explicitly states in his book that the Romans based their houses on the design of temples. He actually believed that, and it's just as well he did, because it's the only evidence he had. And out of that, he created marvelous, marvelous buildings. Well, so much for Italy. Italy got the face off as far as classical architecture goes. They were 150 years ahead of everybody north of the Alps. People north of the Alps, as late as 1600, were still building houses like this black thing with weird windows in the center of the picture. This is the only wooden house that survives in the great city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. But there was a time, as late as 1600, really as late as 1620, when every house in Amsterdam looked like this or looked more or less like this. Is this classical architecture? Well, if you think so, you really should pay your dues to ICAA and learn what they have to teach. This looks like, you know, the illustration of a witch's house in a kid's book about the Brothers Grimm. There's not the least bit of classicism in this house. And it was a perfectly typical city house in Amsterdam or anywhere in Northern Europe as late as 1600. Paris, London, all about the same. Who brought classical architecture to the Netherlands? It's this man. This is a guy named Jacob van Campen, We don't know a lot about him. We don't know a lot about most Dutch architects, but he was the greatest architect in Holland in the generation of Rembrandt and Vermeer. This is one of the greatest artistic generations in human history. And Van Kampen was the architectural equal of those great painters. In 1634, he brings the most perfect classicism to a small space in The Hague. This is the Mauritshuis. It's now a museum. And this building always strikes me speechless. I have to tell you something about it, but it's hard. It is the most perfect building I know. It rises calmly out of the still water of a small canal, like Venus coming up out of the spindrift. It's complicated and simple at once. It's architecturally ambiguous. Is it a brick building with an icing of columns and architraves, or is it a temple with brick and stone infill? And all of this is handled with marvelous clarity by Jacob van Kampen, one of the greatest architects in history, hands down the greatest architect in the Netherlands in the age of Rembrandt and Vermeer, their golden age. And it is Jacob van Kampen who builds the first brick row houses anywhere. These are two houses built in 1622 for two brothers named Coymans. It's hard to see their architectural details because Amsterdam has good street trees, and I wasn't there in the dead of winter. But these are the beginning of the tradition of red brick architecture. The Dutch, incidentally, became the first people to figure out the mass production of bricks. They built kilns that could fire 1 million bricks in a firing, so bricks became cheap. But this is where it begins, with two houses for two brothers in Amsterdam in 1622. Because you can't see the details in this picture, here is a blurry, forgive me, rendering of the Coymans houses. This is the formula of Palazzo Rucellai. This is a box that will keep you warm in the winter and dry in the rain. It will let in the sun or keep it out. But it has, what it presents to you is classical architecture. This is the beginning of classical domestic architecture north of the Alps, and it occurs in Amsterdam, in Holland. The first thing the Dutch do as they classicize their cities is to adapt their pointy gables to look like the facades of Renaissance Italian churches. And some of these are great fun. The Dutch are the first people who figure out how to build middle-class city houses out of durable materials. They're also the first people who figure out that you can make a skinny row house a work of classical architecture. And this is the first way they do it. If you think about the fronts of Italian churches, they mound up like that to cover the basilica roofs. And that's what the first generation of classicists in Holland did. It's what everybody continued to do in Belgium for 150 years. But the Dutch went on beyond that. And by the middle of the 1600s, they have brought full proportional classicism to the design of city houses for middle-class people. On the extreme left, you can see one of these old style semi-classical houses with this church pediment at the top. But most of the picture is taken up with these new style houses. This is what the Dutch have figured out by the middle of the 1600s. They have invented the way of building city houses that we take for granted in cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia. With straight architraves, you have to reverse the flow of the roof when you have a straight architrave, and they do that. To the extent that there is decoration, the decoration is derived from classical models. Look at the swags in that house in the middle, the garlands, and then look around the doors. To the extent that there is ornament, it's pilasters, it's fan lights. This is the beginning of classical city architecture. And in astonishingly short time, it finds its form. The Coymans houses are 1622, and by 1650, the Dutch are more or less mass producing what we think of as row houses, as classical houses. And by 1670, You don't have to be rich or even middle class to do this. If I told you that this was a row of houses in Savannah, Georgia, or Boston, Massachusetts, or some back street in my hometown of Baltimore, I don't think you'd argue with me, but they were built in 1672 in Amsterdam. Uh, this is the birth of our way of building, and it happens in Holland, and it happens in the generation of Rembrandt and Vermeer. It begins with a great architect named Jacob van Campen. Well, not far from Holland is the realm of this lady. This is good Queen Bess, Elizabeth I of England. Is she looking out across the narrow sea to see the first row houses being built? No, because she died before the first row houses were built. And in her day, her capital city of London looked like this. Forgive the graininess of this picture. I wasn't around in 1600. Besides, I can't draw very well. This is London in about 1600. This is Shakespeare's London. If you're wondering whether it's possible for a large house to be a shack, I think this picture answers your question. Not all shacks are small. These are 5-story shacks. They're made of wood. They have exterior plaster. London has a very damp climate, and wood and exterior plaster don't go very well with it. These houses appear to be a little bit creaky. And if you look at the 3rd floor level, you'll see there's an alley between the two houses. Look at the 3rd floor level, you'll see something running horizontally between the two houses. It looks rather like a log. You know what it is? It's a log. If you ask yourself, why would somebody go to the trouble of hauling a log up to the 3rd floor level to sling it across an alley? The answer is to keep the houses from falling down. London, like all cities in Northern Europe in 1600, was a rattletrap city, a city of shacks. It desperately needed somebody to show it how to build urban housing out of durable materials and to give it some style. Here's the man who did that. His name is Inigo Jones, a native Londoner. He became surveyor of the Royal Works in 1615, I believe, and he instantly went to Italy to study up for the job of being surveyor of the King's Works. When he was in Italy, I'm sure he looked at the works of all the great Italian Renaissance architects, but the one he loved most was Andrea Palladio. We've already seen a bit of Palladio. Jones never saw enough of Palladio. He adored Palladio. When he came back, he got a good commission from the king to build a new banqueting house at Whitehall Palace. And here is the first piece of classical architecture in England. It is, as we Americans used to say rather rudely, right off the boat from Italy, except that the windows are bigger and the stonework is made of more durable stone. This is the banqueting house at Whitehall, astonishingly early, 1619. There was nothing remotely like this anywhere in English architecture. English architecture in 1619 was very detail-oriented, and to the extent that classical details were used in English architecture, they were used simply as details. Jones was the English Alberti. He was the English Van Campen. He was the first English architect who understood that classical architecture is a language. It's a complete language of proportion. And he uses the orders properly, gracefully, and he does something else. England's a rather dark climate, and most English buildings in 1619 were dark on the inside as well as on the out. They had a lot of oak paneling and brocaded wallpaper and things like that. Not for Inigo Jones. Here's the good, clear, bright exterior of the banqueting house at Whitehall. And here is the interior, this most marvelous of luminous spaces. This is the birth of classicism in England, brought to you by Inigo Jones and the King, Stuart Kings, James I, and then later Charles I. Charles I. Charles I, when he took over in 1625, kept Jones on, and in 1630, he made Jones the dictator of London development. If you wanted to get a building permit, you had to go through Inigo Jones. You had to please him, and he might even have to design your building for you. As part of the first big development under his jurisdiction, he did design a building. He designed an absolutely revolutionary classical church. St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden. If any of you have read the treatise of the Abbé Loger, which I think is 1755, which derives classical temples from primitive huts, Jones is 100 years ahead, 120 years ahead of the Abbé Loger, with such an extreme classicism that nobody has ever copied it. We know that Jones designed this, the church and the development of Covent Garden. We don't know whether he designed the rest of Covent Garden, but we do know that whoever designed it had to please Jones, because Jones ran the permit office. And here is Covent Garden. It is the first of London's many fashionable residential squares, 1631, 32, 33 in there. It's the first square. There was no word for square. They called it the piazza in Covent Garden. There you see the church in the distance, but look at the houses on the right. Those are brick row houses with pilasters. They have an eaves cornice, as the British would say, or classical entablature, as we would say. They're carried on a Roman arcade. These are the first classical city houses in England, in the first residential square in England. 100 years later, it's become a busy market. If you've ever seen the show My Fair Lady, it later becomes a busier market. This is where Henry Higgins picks up Eliza Doolittle, and now it's a shopping mall. But if you look at those houses on the right, you can see them a little more clearly. They are brick houses. The windows are stacked neatly on top of each other. There's a classical entablature, pilasters, arcade, the birth of classical residential architecture in London, the first brick row houses in London. And if you look down on Covent Garden in the middle of the 17th century, as I'm sure you'd all love to do, here's Wenceslas Haller looking down on it. You can see the piazza in Covent Garden. And if you look on the top side of the piazza, you'll see that all the houses have those straight cornices and dormers. If you look around, you'll see that no other houses in the whole neighborhood have straight cornices, have classical entablatures. They all have pointy gables like medieval houses. Covent Garden, the first big development with Jones as dictator of London development, brings classical domestic architecture to London and sets the pattern for London's development. The next square, Lincoln's Inn Fields, is what you would think of as a London square. These almost identical row houses marching around it. And at one end of Lincoln's Inn Fields is London's equivalent of Palazzo Rucellai. This is Lindsay House. This is the first individual building that pulls all the elements of classicism together, like Palazzo Rucellai or the Coyman's houses. It'll keep you warm in the winter, it'll keep you dry when it rains. But there it is, presenting classical architecture as a fully articulate system. 1640, we don't know whether it was designed by Jones. We do know that somebody had to get through Jones to get a permit to build it. And is it a palace? No, it's in a row. And by 1750, it had been divided into two houses. You're looking at Lindsay House here, but which of those two structures is Lindsay House? It's hard to tell. If you want Q&A at the end, I'll tell you. Actually, it's the one on the right, which is shown as divided into two houses. But this is the Palazzo Rucellai of London, and it is a Palazzo Rucellai in the format of a terrace or a row. It is a row house, and it sets the tone for all the development of London that was to occur into the middle of the 19th century. But all of that stuff happened out in the fashionable parts of Westminster, 2 miles from the center of London. The center of London itself was not so fashionable, and it remained like this through 2/3 of the 17th century, with these rickety shacks, tall shacks, short shacks, trees running across alleys. The center of London, which they call the city of London, remained a medieval construction until one night in 1666, a baker's apprentice got careless, a fire got out of hand, and 80% of the city of London burnt down. It took 3 days. The fire destroyed 14,000 houses, 101 churches, 42 guild halls, and St. Paul's Cathedral, a massive, massive disaster that called for a massive reconstruction. Was there a long debate over how to rebuild London? No. They had Jones's traditions, which had worked for the nobility and gentry. And they had a good new surveyor of the king's works, a fellow named Christopher Wren. Some of you are probably architects, and every architect I've ever known wishes he had more money than he did. So Christopher Wren not only got money, he is money. He's on English money. This is a 50-pound note. Sir Christopher Wren, he proves his classical chops with the new St. Paul's Cathedral. And he's buried right under the dome, and the inscription says, if you seek his monument, look about you. Well, this is to England what Alberti's San Andrea is. This is where Wren proves his classical chops. He pretty much runs the rebuilding committee for London. Oh, by the way, he invents what we think of as the Protestant parish church. You in Philadelphia have two absolutely beautiful variants of this kind of a church down in Society Hill. And here is the new London as it is rebuilt after the fire. It takes 7 years to build. They built 14,000 houses, and the rebuilding ordinance passed by Parliament in record time requires the new London to look like Amsterdam, or to look like the squares that are growing up around the court. So this becomes the pattern for English development. This is Sir Christopher Wren carrying on the work of Inigo Jones. And this shows you the vision of the new London, the rebuilt London. Everything you can see in this picture is classical architecture. St. Paul's is classical public architecture of the grandest possible type. The foreground, brick houses with eaves cornices or simple entablatures. And they're very simple because the British didn't want them to catch fire and burn down. But this is the row house as the vernacular of classicism. Well, how did we do in this country? The first settlers to come from England to North America came in 1630, and they came to Massachusetts. In 1630, Inigo Jones had not yet begun to classicize English domestic architecture. He barely got started by 1642, and 1642 is the year that the Puritan migrations end, because in 1642, the English Puritans stop leaving and start rebelling and cut off the king's head. So New England gets almost all of its settlers in 12 years between 1630 and 1642, and doesn't have many more for 200 years until the Irish potato famine. New England is settled by people who never saw Covent Garden, who never saw Lincoln's Inn Fields, never saw Lindsay House, never saw the rebuilding of London after the fire. And classical architecture did not take root in New England. Here is a perfectly typical 17th century rich man's house in Salem, Massachusetts, the House of Seven Gables. Somebody wrote a book about it once. When you build a building like this one that's dated 1680 in the Pediment in Boston, you'd better maintain it well, because if you don't, it will sag and it will look like this. New England did not have a native row house tradition or a native classical tradition. It built all through the 1600s and through almost all of the 1700s as if Inigo Jones had never lived, still a medieval building culture. And this is the house of Paul Revere, the guy who rode and saw one if by land and two if by sea. And it could have been built at many times in the Middle Ages, anywhere in England or in many parts of Northern Europe. New England did not participate in the Inigo Jones revolution of classical urban architecture. Boston, fortunately, eventually came up with its own Inigo Jones. This is the Inigo Jones of Boston, the Inigo Jones of New England. His name was Charles Bulfinch. He got out of Harvard in 1786. He toured Europe, and he came back to bring modern British classical architecture to Boston. And he proved his chops with the state capitol of Massachusetts, which is certainly a magnificent American classical building, dominating Boston Common to this day and dominating it very beautifully. What did he do about houses? He designed and built and developed and went bankrupt over the first row of houses ever built in Boston or ever built in New England. This is a crescent like the crescents in Bath, Tontine Crescent. It is a crescent of row houses, the first row houses in New England, made of brick, the first brick row houses, obviously, in New England. Are they classical? Here is the one photograph that survives. The whole place was torn down in 1857. Yes, indeed. This is the delicate classicism of the Adam brothers at the end of the 18th century. This is classical architecture brought to New England by a man with a mission, the Inigo Jones of Boston, Charles Bulfinch. He builds the Boston version of Palazzo Rucellai. This is a house for a guy named Harrison Gray Otis. It's in Mount Vernon Street on Beacon Hill. It'll keep you warm in the winter. It'll keep you dry in the rain. And it will show you the system of classical architecture. But he didn't stop there. He built row houses. This is Colonnade Row. This is also the work of Bulfinch. Bulfinch, like Inigo Jones, is a man with a mission, the mission of bringing classical architecture to his town. And for Bulfinch, the designer of the Massachusetts State House, this is classical architecture, just as much as his State House is. Finally, let me bring you home, to your home, to the capital of Pennsylvania. Kind of wish it still were. I go to Harrisburg every now and then, and I wish Philadelphia were the capital of Pennsylvania. Penn making his treaty with the Indians. And here's the house where Penn stayed when he was in Philadelphia. It's made of brick, and it was called the Slate Roof House. If it had been built in Boston, it would have been called the Brick House. And the fact that it wasn't called the Brick House in Philadelphia should show you that brick was not an atypical building material in Philadelphia in its early years. Slate obviously was, but brick was perfectly typical. Philadelphia was settled, as I would assume you all know, in 1682. By that time, Covent Garden was 50 years old. By that time, London had been rebuilt, and the job was finished. And the builders who had rebuilt London were all out of work. And they went all throughout the British Isles, and I will bet that some of them came to Philadelphia. And they created a building culture modeled on the rebuilt London. Here is the new London, which was built between 1667 and 1674. Is there anything like this in Philadelphia? I asked Mr. Google, and he showed me this. Not much difference. This is where your building culture comes from. You are fully in the London tradition, not the medieval London tradition, but the classical London tradition of Inigo Jones and Christopher Wren. So is Philadelphia a classical city? You bet. It had the Bank of Pennsylvania, the first Greek-influenced building in America, and look at that beautiful dome. It has Strickland's Exchange. You sure have some beautiful classical architecture. You have this wonderful, wonderful classical temple of a museum. And you have more row houses than any city in the United States. This is in many ways my favorite street in the United States. It is a beautiful street of row houses. It is a beautiful street of classical architecture. So thank you, Philadelphia. And if you're interested in reading more stories about the North Atlantic cities, you can buy the book from northatlanticcities.com. And if you do, I will give 40% of the proceeds to my nonprofit sponsors in Philadelphia, to whom I am very, very grateful for bringing me to you. So thank you very much. That's it. You can mute me or do whatever you're going to do to me. Time for the people to take their revenge.
Okay. All right, Charlie, that was fantastic. Thank you very, very much. and I'm like all of us, I'm sure we want to know more about your interpretation of how Philadelphia evolved as a row home city. So what does that mean? It means we have to buy the book and read it. Here you go. Okay. All right. It's a great book. I've been enjoying it myself. I think you will enjoy it. And not just because it involves Philadelphia, because it does, but because everything leads up to, like all roads lead to Rome. Well, in this case, they lead to Philadelphia. So I would really encourage you all to read the book. It's wonderful. All right. So having said that, and of course you can see the website there on your screen. So if you need information about the book and how to order it, there you go. Do it. I got the book in less than a week. So maybe not quite as good as Amazon Prime, but darn close. So give it a shot. All right. Okay. Next, we're going to do some questions. And boy, they're popping up like crazy all of a sudden. So let's see what I can do. Right. So, first of all, does Philadelphia have its own version of the Palazzo Rucellai? What do you think, Charlie?
What do I think? What I think it probably does, and it's probably the Bingham House, but I don't know. And it's time for one of you to take up arms against a sea of troubles. Philadelphia is the only American city that has row houses and does not have a book about its row houses. I once asked Jeff Cohen, why is there no book about Philadelphia row houses? And Jeff said, I've been busy. One of you, please get busy and write a book on Philadelphia row houses. I want to know the answer to that question. I can tell you the Palazzo Rucellai of every other American row house city, but not yours. Write the book.
Jeff, I hope you're listening. All right. Okay. If not, we'll make sure you hear that. All right. All right.
I've heard it before. I hope so.
No doubt. All right. Did each American city with row houses have its own style or sense of proportion?
The answer is yes. And some of them are quite similar. Some of them are quite different. Let's think about your city of Philadelphia and my city of Baltimore. Similarities. We are preeminently the two cities that have long back buildings. You'll have two rooms at the front, and those two front rooms run the full width of the lot. But then there will be a tail on the back of the building. The tail can be one room, two rooms, sometimes in big houses, even three rooms. This is quite peculiar to Baltimore and Philadelphia. You don't see it at all in London. You don't see it in New York. So in that sense, Baltimore and Philadelphia are very similar. But there's a difference. And Jeff Cohen says it better than anyone. He refers to Baltimore as the land of mighty cornices. We like our houses to be taller relative to the street width than you do in Philadelphia. Or I'm coming to think that probably both cities have about the same sense of proportion. It's just that Baltimore streets are a little bit wider than Philadelphia streets. And so we have to pad our houses at the top by giving them Jeff Cohen style mighty cornices. So Baltimore and Philadelphia are very similar. New York, if you think about New York, the typical New York brownstone has a basement that's half a story up out of the ground or more, and has an enormous flight of steps up to it. And there's very little like that in Baltimore or Philadelphia, very little like it in much of Boston, and nothing remotely like it in Amsterdam or anywhere in the UK. It's a real New York peculiarity. So there are lots of variations. It's time for somebody who is a serious architectural historian, and I'm not, to delve into those really fun facts. That's another book that I would like to read, but I'm already at work on another book and it's about something else. So.
Alrighty. All right. Next question. How did the crescents start like the one in Bath?
Damned if I know. That's a wonderful question. I have no idea. I think Bath is the first of them. Why was it built that way? I think because John Wood the Younger was a genius. That's a really good question. I don't know. Have to look it up in Walter Eisen's book. That's exactly the kind of question that people typically don't ask. They ask about why the columns are spaced the way they are, but they don't ask the number one question. Why is it a crescent, not a row, not a circus? Good question.
All right. Okay. I'm going to combine two questions because there's some commonality between them. So number one, Why the extra large windows in Amsterdam, which leads to the next one, which is, what is the, did the Dutch use sash windows earlier than the English in the townhouse or row house?
The Dutch invented the sash window, and they used it earlier than the English did. But they didn't invent it until late in the 17th century. And the Dutch perfected what we think of as the row house before they had sash windows. So the early row houses would have had leaded glass windows with big wooden shutters on the inside or even the outside. Why are the windows so large? Holland's a cloudy, dark climate. I think they wanted to get as much light as possible. And if you walk Dutch cities at night, even today, you'll see that the people never draw their curtains. They just love to see and be seen. I think it's a real Dutch peculiarity. I wish the English had done it, because England's a dark climate too, and their houses are too dark. They need big windows like the Dutch. But the Dutch did invent the sash window, and the English copied it pretty fast.
All right, so we're running out of time almost. I'm going to combine two questions because I think they connect. So many row houses were taxed by the width, not height. Was this the case in most cities, which leads to, how do the smaller Trinity houses of Philadelphia fit into the history of row houses?
The second question is easy. Write the book on Philadelphia row houses. I will read it and then I'll tell you. As for systems of taxation, no two cities have the same system of taxation. They're all over the map. And some cities tax this and some cities tax that. London typically taxed hearths. They didn't care how wide your house was or how tall it was. They wanted to know how many fireplaces you had. That's how they measured the size of a house for the longest time. So many different systems of taxation. No
Great, Charlie. Great. All right, that brings us just up to 7 o'clock. So before everybody jumps off, I would like, so Charlie, fantastic. We're going to start getting somebody to write that book you're talking about, Philadelphia row house. So Jeff Cohen's on notice, as well as the rest of the Philadelphia architects.
Jeff says he's busy. You've got
Jeff's semi-retired. He's not busy.
We have a large audience here. There must be some pretty smart people,
including Jeff. So we'll work on Jeff.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So in the meantime, Sir Charlie, thank you, and we'll look forward to you coming to Philadelphia sometime and give the talk in person.
Oh, I love it.
Great, kudos, Charlie. Thank you so much. All righty.
Good.
Take care. All right, or else we'll come to Baltimore to bother you. Okay.
Home and away.
There you go.
Great.
So, okay. Union League Legacy Foundation programming coming up. We have on August 26th, our next Civil War Roundtable, which will feature Bernard Kempinski talking about Civil War railroads. We've never done that before, so that should be really fascinating, because without the railroads, it would have been a very different war. So on September the 2nd, a public affairs meeting with Alex Gorski, a Union League member who happens to be the chairman and CEO of Johnson & Johnson. And I'm guessing you can figure out what he's going to be talking about. All right, that'll be that. And for anybody who wants to go back and look at some more Union League architecture, the Legacy Foundation is running a series of programs called Mondays with Monday. There you go. They will appear on the Union League Legacy Foundation Facebook page and its YouTube page on Mondays. And on August the 3rd, the subject was the Broad Street Building Then and Now. So it's really kind of neat. I mean, it lasts about 15 minutes, so that's not too long, but you'll see the building as the interiors as they progressed from the earliest photographic evidence we have from 1887 up to the present. So it's a good program. So give it a shot. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining us. We really do appreciate it. I want to thank all of the Union League members who joined us, the ICAA members who joined us, and the Society of Architectural Historians who joined us. So keep watching. We'll be doing this again sometime. So thank you, Juan. Thank you all. And stay safe out there. It's still a little dangerous and crazy. Okay. All right. Good night, everybody.